Hello, my dear friends. How are you? I hope I find you all in good health and safe and sound. Welcome. Thank you for joining me here. I'm Marty Theriger, and today I would like to end this year the way it all started when 9 years ago I officially began to create content for YouTube, and I have started on the 21st of December of 2016, precisely with a video about Yule. Since then, there's been quite a lot of studies. I have done a lot of research. Almost every year in these past 9 years, I have delivered to you videos on this subject during the December month and the mood of the season. And progressively, I have come to demystify and correct several misconceptions and misinterpretations. And indeed, the more we dig into this subject, the more we come to realize that, unfortunately, there's quite a lot about the December celebrations, festivities we thought to be pagan or of pagan origin, but are more often than not, they are either neo-pagan inventions or actually Christian celebrations. But of course, there's quite a lot of traditions of this period and of folklore that still invokes a pagan past in their origins, obviously. But as I said, over the years, there's been plenty of misconceptions towards the pagan origins of Christmas, and even misinformation circulating and concerning the very pagan celebrations and festivities of this period of the year. For instance, there's been a lot of talk, as an example, concerning the Christmas tree and its pagan origins, especially linking it to the Old Norse pagan motif of the Tree of Life, Yggdrasil, when in fact that connection was, unfortunately, only created by the Nazis in the 1930s. So I'm not here today to talk about the Christmas tree, of course, even though in itself it would be an interesting subject too, as well, in my opinion, of course. And I would like to point out that while recent research and scholars have debated whether the Christmas tree is pagan or not, and the most recent studies dismiss it as a pagan and indeed as a pagan motif and indeed a recent misconception, as such a motif is most likely rooted in Christian tradition, I don't think we should so quickly dismiss it, and it may be rather problematic to conclude the Christmas tree to be or as just as just and simply a Christian religious motif, right? I mean, it is true that it may very well be a recent tradition from the late medieval Germany, probably already a conception from the early modern period, Protestant conception, and only later on in the 19th century it began as a tradition of mounting up a tree as decoration for Christmas. And as I said, there's no doubt that in the 20th century the Christmas tree was a target of Nazi propaganda, which reinterpreted it as a representation of the Old Norse Tree of Life, Yggdrasil. However, we have to take into consideration that religious traditions, despite the historical shifts of religious ideologies and conceptions, in part often survive through folk traditions. And there's seldom a brutal and defined destruction of traditions, because among the collective mentality, worldviews, and cognitive landscape of the populations, religious conceptions adapt and mutate into new religious conceptions. And that is very noticeable within Catholicism, as an example, when certain pagan conceptions and belief systems start to be integrated into a Christian cosmological view. Even though the Christmas tree in itself is most likely a product of Protestant religious iconography, we have to take into consideration that folk beliefs have always had a considerable part to play in the shaping of religious iconography, and it's likely that even though the Christmas tree is likely to be a Christian conception, indeed, part of older beliefs will eventually be inserted in this Christian cosmological view, because it's part of people's identities, even though at the time it's highly unlikely people were aware of the origins of many of their beliefs at the time. Even so, certain conceptions inevitably fall into new religious cosmological views. This is how culture is constructed. We may forget the origins of things, but we never truly lose certain understandings. We just incorporate them into new realities, into new cosmological views, right? So the Christmas tree is not pagan, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have rather pagan motifs in it. This is important to underline, right? The Christmas tree was not created as a pagan religious motif, but due to a long-lasting ideological set of pre-Christian belief systems that one way or another constitute part of the identity of a people and therefore are part of culture. Inevitably, unknowingly, pagan motifs will be incorporated into different religious ones because motifs, symbols, iconography, cosmological views, etc., it's a continuous construction of culture and identity. And if a Christian motif is inserted into a culture, people will also want to give to it part of their own identity that has been constructed for thousands of years, right? So, indeed, the Christmas tree is a Christian religious conception with also pagan motifs, because important symbols and motifs within the identity of a culture will always be associated with new conceptions that inevitably are inserted into cosmological views. Therefore, yes, there are indeed many reciprocal influences from Christianity on the pagan world and from the pagan world onto the Christian world. I'm underlining this because this is why it's so hard to understand if Christmas is indeed pagan or not and what are its origins. It's not something concrete. It's not a monolithic block, right? And something easy to determine because various religious conceptions and animistic worldviews continue to be part of people's cultural identities and inevitably inserted into the shifting ideas on the religious cosmological perception. Cultural identity shapes religions, just as religions then ultimately adds more elements to cultural identity. All right, so let's get into today's subject. Yule is an English term that in popular culture is associated with a ghostly winter solstice festival that was supposedly held by Germanic peoples. The term first appears in Gothic script on the 5th, 6th century calendar, where it takes the form of, well, which you can see on the screen somewhere in here, or Yule in Latin letters, and apparently indicates a month. The full form is Fruma Yule, which could indicate the month of November, although this is not entirely certain and is still a case of study as of the taping of this video. And about 3 centuries later, the Venerable Bede Venerabilis, cites the Anglo-Saxon calendar in his work De Temporum Ratione, the reckoning of time, telling us that it began with Mondrenek, Mother's Night, between the 2 months of Here, Geila, or December, and Eftara Geila, or January, right? So 2 months have the same term, right? The previous Yule and the following Yule, December and January respectively, right? So nothing is mentioned about any festivals held during this period. That's the point. It is likely that none occurred, but the most important point is that the central point of these 2 months was far from the day of the solstice, thus disproving the idea recently developed in neo-pagan circles that Yule was a solstice festival. It wasn't, right? I have already spoken here on this channel about the Old Norse pagan calendar in relation to the actual annual celebrations of the ancient pagan calendar of the Scandinavian peninsula before Haakon I, in which we have Yule as a celebration that, as among the Anglo-Saxons, also did not occur on the winter solstice, but rather a rotating multi-day celebration that followed the lunar calendar. Only later, with King Haakon I of Norway, was this festivity progressively shifted to a fixed day in December. But more on this topic in this video I have made about it, right? Where you will find all these explanations, right? I'll put the video in the description of this video as well. Well, in Icelandic word for Christmas, the Icelandic word for Christmas is Yule, in the plural. In fact, it is the name of a pagan holiday, whose details are very obscure, as we have no contemporary sources that tell us exactly what was done on the occasion, apart from a generic account of how the sacrifices were performed, as we shall see in a moment, further ahead. But many traditions that likely originated in the Christian era have often been seen as remnants of pagan festivities, and through the analysis of Christian festivities, attempts have been made to extrapolate supposed surviving pagan elements to reconstruct the form of these pagan festivities. So, judging from the sources we actually have, Yule was a winter festival celebrated between January and the beginning of February in the vast majority of cases, since it rotated in relation to the phases of the moon, particularly in relation to the full moon, and sometimes in some contexts the celebration would last several days. Therefore, it was very far from the date of the Christian Christmas, which, as we will see, was not fixed on December the 25th to replace other pre-Christian festivities, as it is repeated over and over again, especially in neo-pagan circles. But it just isn't true, right? But let's proceed step by step. Let's set aside for a moment, for now, the absolutely nonsensical and ridiculous idea of suggesting that a festival held somewhere in January in the most remote frontier of medieval Christianity, in Scandinavia, at the end of the first millennium would have somehow influenced the formation of the Christian Christmas in Rome centuries earlier. Let's see instead what we know about pre-Christian celebrations in the Nordic world. But once again, I tell you, I advise you to watch the video I've mentioned earlier. And in fact, it's better to leave a list of videos that I've made about this subject, about Yule and these celebrations, suggested in the description of this very video. In that video I've mentioned earlier, I already talked about an important figure in Norwegian history who changed the landscape of religion in Scandinavia, especially in relation to Christianity. The famous saga of Haakon the Good, Haakonar saga Goda, or Haakonar saga Alstein Fostra, the third in the compilation of sagas of the Norwegian kings known as Heimskringla, succinctly recounts that animals were sacrificed and idols of the gods, as well as gifts, and those present, the people present there, were blessed by something which functioned as sprinklers dipped into a chalice where the sacrificial blood was collected, right? While the meat was cooked and consumed, accompanied by alcoholic beverages. We have few details, very few details, and it's even more difficult to understand how this festival, this celebration of Yule, was actually conducted religiously speaking. However, the account is somewhat suspicious as well, as you probably have guessed, all right? Given that the saga was composed in the Christian era and seems to reflect the author's imagination about the pagan past, based on the Christian customs to which he was accustomed to, right? I've also spoken of this in a video I've done about Old Norse religion, in which I have touched on the subject of the Nordic or the Old Norse pagan temples, whose accounts from Iceland are all Christian from two different periods, even more further away from the pagan past than the account within Heimskringla, which is the one we are dealing with here, and seems indeed to be again a Christian interpretation on how Christians imagined the pagan temples were like, based on what they were more familiar with in their societies, which were churches, the Christian churches. But more on that other video, right? But we keep seeing the same parallel here, right? So in relation to the account of the Yule religious celebration, we are talking about a composition by a Christian living in a society that was already officially Christian at least 200 years before his birth. Therefore, the idols it talks about in this account resemble typical statues from Catholic churches. No pagan votive statues have been found in archaeological excavations so far. The sprinkled blood, recalls the wine transformed into the blood of Christ. And we must take into account, right, that the wine drunk at Mass was indeed poured, and even the priest bathed at some point in this wine, which is a representation of the blood of Christ. The consumption of meat and alcohol recalls Christian communion, again, the body and blood of Christ, right, again. And even the sprinkling ritual seems to be modeled on the Christian ritual of sprinkling the crowd with holy water. There are no independent sources to confirm this liturgy, which seems to be a caricature of the Christian one. Therefore, what I'm really saying here is that the only source on how the pagan Yule was conducted in Scandinavia was written by a Christian who lived 200 years after Christianity became the official religion in his society, and also lived in a society that was not at all the same as the one that existed in a geographical and temporal reality far removed from his own. Not only is there no mention of solstice-related rites in this account, and how could there be, right? The festival or the celebration didn't even occur during the solstice. But the saga also recounts how the king, Haakon I, had the date of the Yule moved to coincide with Christmas, the already existing Christmas. The saga itself tells us that it became a Christian celebration, and I quote, if you will, please. King Haakon was a devout Christian when he arrived in Norway, but as the whole country was pagan, with many blood sacrifices and many powerful lords, he felt he desperately needed followers and popular support. Therefore, he decided to practice Christianity secretly, observing the celebration of Sunday and the fasting of Friday. However, he established by law that the Yule should begin at the time when Christians celebrated Christmas, and that each person should have a measure of beer corresponding to about 16 liters, or else pay a fine to sanctify the feast for as long as the beer lasted. Previously, the Yule celebrations were held around the night of midwinter, January 12th, for 3 nights. There is a very important aspect here, right? We see once again religion used as a tool of power to establish a cohesive and unified monarchy. While pagan societies existed in Scandinavia, contrary to what many neo-pagans and people of the spiritual world, the spiritual gurus may say, and this goes in line with the content I have expressed in the previous video about New Age gurus and spiritual leaders and their distorted notions of the pagan past. The truth is that pagans were not united, much less united by a single faith. As in all pagan realities all over Europe, different groups would be constantly fighting for control of lands and to establish their power and governance, rulership. The truth is that internally, Scandinavia was being torn apart by these conflicts of lords, which indeed it is the entire premise of the Viking Age. The Viking Age was just that, right? Various groups of wealthy lords, kings, and landowners who had enough power and wealth to have a group of warriors, a levy, to plunder and kill and control trade routes to gain more power, establish their rule, and become ever richer and more powerful. The entire Viking occupation in the sense of profession, right, and activity of a person becoming Viking, was driven by a gang mentality. Here, what happens with Håkon, King Håkon I, is precisely an attempt to secure his power as absolute king of Norway, creating a union through religion, Christianity, unifying everyone under one faith, one creed, and implementing his Christian monarchy, following the other model of continental Europe. He was successful for a variety of reasons. It's not worth repeating here what I've said in so many other videos in the past. Did the bloodshed and wars and conflict truly come to an end when Norway was Christianized, united under Christianity? Of course not. People are people, and the power struggles remain to this day. The point is that just because people were once pagan doesn't mean they were all united and at peace, or they were peaceful and Christianity came to disrupt it all. Now, what's really important for today's video is that many neo-pagans have been supposedly celebrating the Nordic pagan Yule, but in reality they have been celebrating on the dates that King Håkon established as a Christian festival and celebrating the Christian Yule, and not the true pagan celebration of this time, which was related to the lunar calendar. Furthermore, the entire description of this festival in the only source that mentions it is suspiciously very similar to the Christian one, due to the account of the Christian author living in a society where he was much more familiar with the Christian reality. In fact, much of Norse literature concerning the pagan past is actually a collection of compilations and translations from the lives of Christian missionaries and saints who interacted in the far past with pagans in the past of their history. Therefore, they are not first-hand sources, but rather sources displaced temporally, geographically, and religiously from accounts written by Christian missionaries. So the king changed the date of Yule to coincide with the already existing Christmas and forced his subjects to celebrate the birth of Jesus without their knowledge, intending to accustom them to celebrating on that night Christmas in preparation for conversion. But how, you ask? Hadn't Christmas been superimposed on previous pagan festivities? Well, clearly in the case of Yule in the north, this doesn't hold up. In Scandinavia, Christmas and Yule were not the same thing. Christmas already existed for centuries and came to replace Yule not as a pagan celebration turned Christian, but a well-established Christian celebration that already existed before Yule, replacing the pagan one in the north in Scandinavia. And what about Sol Invictus and Saturnalia? This is also a fairly widespread misconception, right? And here are the facts. The Saturnalia was celebrated between December the 17th and the 23rd. Therefore, there is no overlap. There are no significant traces of the cult of Sol Invictus in the Roman Empire before Elagabalus in 218 of the Common Era, and after his death in 222, the cult survived only sporadically as Elagabalus was very unpopular. Aurelian is said to have ennobled Sol Invictus in 274, but its celebration on December the 25th is first recorded in the chronograph, the calendar of 354. And by that time, Christmas was already established, well established, on that date, on the 25th of December, as witnessed by Hippolytus of Rome between 202 and 204, who wrote in Greek, and I quote, if you please, "As for the first incarnation of the Savior, when he was born in Bethlehem, it was 8 days before the calends of January, December the 25th, on the 4th day of the week, Thursday, when Augustus had already reigned for 42 years, 2 or 3 before the Common Era. Therefore, the celebration of Christmas also has nothing to do with the Roman celebrations of Saturnalia and of the cult of Sol Invictus. We must remember that early Christians, primitive Christianity, wanted to stand out as something completely different in their celebrations compared to the pagan ones. Of course, there are pagan elements in Christian religious conceptions, and of course, the figure of Christ himself reflects some pagan cults to pagan gods, pagan deities, especially gods of vegetation. And, of course, some pagan festivities eventually became Christian festivities, but Christmas, contrary to what is said, especially by neo-pagans and spiritual gurus, that is a celebration that stems from Saturnalia or the cult of Sol Invictus and even the Norse Yule, is clearly not the case, not true at all. But how have we come about December the 25th? Well, several traditions relate the date of the crucifixion as March 25th. Tertullian recounts how Jesus was crucified during the reign of Tiberius in the time of the consuls Rufius and Rebellius Geminus in the month of March, at the time of Easter, on the 8th day before the calends of April, March the 25th, right? Even Pseudo-Cyprian in De Pacha Computos, 230, circa 230, assumes that the world was created in spring from the equinox, and since man was created a few days later, according to him, Jesus must have been conceived on the same day as the creation of Adam, therefore the 25th, right? Saint Augustine, 4th century, in the 4th book of De Trinitate, explains precisely that tradition affirms that Jesus was crucified on March 25th and that his traditional date of birth, conception, derives from this. In ancient times, it was believed that great men were conceived and died on the same date. If Jesus was crucified on March the 25th, he must also have been conceived on March 25th and therefore born 9 months later. Calculating 9 months ahead, we arrive at December the 25th. A conventional and traditional calculation, therefore without any intention of overlapping with another date of another celebration. But if it were intentional to overlap with the date of another festivity, this doesn't invalidate either the Christian celebration or the pagan celebrations. I think what's important is what people want to celebrate and the meaning of those celebrations. But that's just my opinion, right? But anyway, the truth is that the influence of Christianity on pagan cults, has been largely underestimated and understudied, and that many of the parallels between Christianity and paganism are often crude approximations that do not do justice to the diverse landscape of earlier pagan cults, which frequently competed with each other, clashed, or engaged in discourse or a dialogue. There was no monolithic block of paganism in opposition to Christianity. That's the point, that's the reality. The cult of Sol Invictus in Rome was recent and very unusual, short-lived actually, and had no significant parallels in Eastern solar cults as claimed by old theories long abandoned in academic circles. So, you know what really prevents us today from understanding what pagan celebrations were truly like? Well, beyond the lack of sources, of course, the assumptions and underestimation of the influence of Christianity on pagan cults, and not the other way around, often due to neo-pagan inventions and New Age spirituality gurus, do not really help us to understand the past of religions. We quickly, so quickly jump to conclusions and immediately assume that paganism influenced Christianity, which happened in many cases as well, surely. And I myself, admittedly, many years ago, also jumped to those same conclusions because it's very easy to do that. But the other way around is, in fact, historically speaking, also true. So the truth is, if we turn things around and research with a more open mind to find the truth, or try to find the truth as much as possible, and not to find what we want to be true to legitimize our beliefs, we will see that Christianity had an absolutely tremendous influence on some important pagan celebrations and belief systems as well. It's not really a monolith of pagan versus Christianity in the long history where these systems of belief have interacted. There have been multiple and diverse outcomes from this interaction. I mean, in this video, I will not delve into the demonstrably false invention of the supposed Indian cults of Mitra or other cults, a 19th century theory now absolutely discredited in historical circles, but very present in the poor quality articles that circulate like a plague on the internet, all over the internet. Nor will I address the history of other holidays, such as All Saints' Day, perpetually considered a poorly made copy of a supposed Celtic New Year without any proof, actually, or Easter or other holidays. I've done that in the past in other videos. The absurdity is that ancient documents actually reveal that the first Christians were actually very eager to distinguish themselves from the pagans, not to imitate them or mirror them. Indeed, some scholars claim that if anything should be said about this, it is that the dates of the holidays that coincided with the pagan ones were chosen despite this and not because of it, right? Anyway, I have already taken too much of your time. I just want to say, celebrate whatever you want and don't come with that nonsense about one celebration being better than the other, or that one came first, or that this one and that one were stolen, or, you know, whatever. Well, now, it's time to say goodbye. A very fond farewell. This video isn't just the last one of this year, but also the last one for an undetermined period here on YouTube, on this platform. As I told you in the past, due to my convictions, what I believe is right and what I fight for, my presence on this platform will have to be considerably reduced because of YouTube's attitudes and conduct towards supporting and promoting the apartheid regime and ethnic cleansing of native populations carried out by Israel. All of this is explained in some videos I've posted here on YouTube a couple of months ago, and why I am leaving this platform and reducing my presence here at least. And I'll leave those videos in the description of this video, right? So you can check those and understand why I am leaving and my attitude towards this. As I also said in those videos, I'm not ending the channel, right? You have over 600 of my videos to watch. And from time to time, I'll come here for an update and to announce my work, as I will continue working on these subjects, but this time on Patreon, the Patreon platform. You can continue to visit me on Patreon, and if you can, obviously, become a patron and continue to help with these studies. Maybe one day I'll fully return to YouTube. I don't know when, but certainly when this platform becomes, let's say, decent at the very least, and depending on how the geopolitical stage will develop in the coming years. I am obviously against systems of oppression and genocide, as any other person with the minimum of empathy and intelligence should be, but anyway. And that's why I don't want a platform like YouTube to continue making money from my content and that money being channeled to help strengthen a regime that I don't agree with and I am openly against. I am against Zionists and against Zionism, and I believe that Zionism is one of the biggest problems in our world and frankly an affront to the very life and well-being of human populations. Therefore, whoever wants and can continue to follow my work, I will be on Patreon, right? And you can continue to sort of following me also through my hobby, my solo music project called Varum, right? And you can also continue to listen to my musical productions. As I said, from time to time, I will come here to visit, to give you updates, right? Thank you very much for these 9 years. It was very good, very interesting, and also enriching on many levels, especially intellectually speaking. And it even changed my life for the better by allowing me to create content on this platform. Honestly, I mean, I could simply ignore what's happening in the world and continue here, right? But I can't do that, and I will continue fighting. But I am absolutely very grateful for all the friendship, support, affection, love, for all the words you shared with me, and all the knowledge and enthusiasm shared here. It was truly a good and enriching experience. Many good memories. Obviously, I'm sad, a bit sad, of course, but I won't disappear completely, as I said, and the work and the fight continue. Thank you all very much. Many of you were truly great company and greatly changed my perspective on human beings and how goodness still exists in this world and in people, and that it's worth fighting for a better world and for everyone's well-being. I mean, the community continues, right? Thank you, my dear friends. Thank you for today. As always, until we meet again, my dear friends, farewell.